Hello everyone, this is Raven Ironwing, and welcome back to my channel. In one of my previous videos, I took an old HP Office PC and I gutted it entirely, and I took all of those parts from the inside along with some upgrades, and I put them in a brand new case, making an ultra-budget gaming PC. And I sold that PC to someone that gave it to their son for a gift so they could play Minecraft on it. But in today's video, we will be discussing the ultimate fate of that old HP case. Did I throw it away? No. Stay tuned to find out. So let's roll that intro. As a child of the 1980s, I grew up playing the original Atari 2600 and learned how to program at a very young age on the Commodore 64. We didn't get our first IBM-compatible PC until 1992, and there, if you look closely, you can see me using a Franklin spelling ace to double-check my spelling on our word processor, because we didn't have a built-in spell checker back then. It makes me laugh to this day. It was, however, a computer that we all had to share as a family, and my mom wouldn't let me do certain things on it, so I went to the local dumpster behind a business and dug out some computer parts and built my first computer, and that led to this long quest to progressively build better computers out of parts that people were throwing away so I could make basic programs on them. And my ultimate goal was to make this amazing RPG like Final Fantasy, and here you can see some clips of the original QBasic game that I programmed. It was called The Dragon Man, and I never finished the thing, but it was very similar to Final Fantasy 1 or Dragon Warrior. Not quite as good graphics-wise, but I was learning and getting there. And as a teenager, this is a clip of my bedroom. I built my own computer lab so I could play LAN games with my friends. Only I realized after that I didn't have any friends. I then started my career in IT at the local community college where I worked there for a year, and that eventually led to working for a bunch of different businesses until I eventually ended up at a data center at a university. And I worked there for like 4 years until some kind of dark times happened to me in my life, and I won't go into the details, but I was very depressed. It wasn't until a friend years later suggested that I try gaming to overcome my depression that I discovered Skyrim. And in Skyrim I found this beautiful world where I could explore, which led me to want to explore the real world, so I totally changed my life. And it was then I decided to take my first cross-country trip, and I bought some land in the middle of nowhere and lived out there peacefully for about 5 years. It was great. But now I'm back and into IT again. Which brings us back to that poor empty case. It reminded me of my old days digging through the garbage, and I decided I was going to do something with that case and make it into a truly unique PC that represented me and all the decades that I've lived. So I took parts from every decade I had lived in and made a functional PC out of them. And I also had the goal of making it look like HP built this PC. So I used HP OEM parts. I found a Pentium J 2900, a very unique CPU for this very unique build. And then I stuck a Dayton audio exciter in it and turned the entire case into a speaker. After installing Linux on it, making it into a Bluetooth speaker was super easy. And I can just turn it on without even switching the monitor on, connect to it through my phone and play music. It works great. And then I just press the power button, when I'm done it turns itself off. So then I thought, I have this old guitar link that I rarely ever use because it's such a hassle. So I can take this apart, cut down the PCB and replace the front panel audio with this. And that's exactly what I did. So I can just plug a guitar directly into my PC now. And I hooked that up to a makeshift internal hub I made, and it works great. Then I got to thinking, is it possible to game on such a low power CPU? And I figured out how to take a full-size GPU and modify a PCIe by 1 slot and stick that in. But the only GPU I had that was compatible with this system was a GT610, and that wasn't very useful. I mean, the GT610 makes the GT710 look amazing. It's that bad. So I made plans to find a better GPU that would fully max out the potential of the lowly Pentium J2900, but in the meantime I decided to have some more fun with this, and that's when I took some old Commodore 64 ports, the original Commodore 64 ports that I ordered all the way from Hungary, and I modified them using a USB adapter to make your own joysticks, and it works great. And I played Minecraft using an Atari joystick. Then I had the problem of where am I going to hide this USB joystick controller, and someone suggested making a fake hard drive, and I had a box that fit perfectly in the slot, so I did just that. I covered it with some construction paper, stuck a fake label on it, and it looks kind of like an actual hard drive. It looks good enough that it fooled some of my viewers at least. Then I was back to trying to solve the GPU problem, and I ordered a GT1030 that I thought would work, but the seller never shipped it out. Then I ordered an RX 550 that was an HP brand one. I thought this'll be perfect, but it got lost in the mail. And then I ordered another GT1030, and I finally got it. And I tried it out, and it didn't work. I was so disappointed because I really wanted to put a GT1030 in this machine to make Dawid proud, but I just couldn't get it to work. So I had to give up and try a different GPU, and that's when I found the GTX 650 Ti. After 4 failed attempts at getting a GPU that worked well with this system, was the GT 650 Ti going to be the savior of this build? When it finally came in the mail and I unwrapped it, there was only one problem. It was a Dell, not an HP, but I knew exactly how to fix that. And there we were, off to the races. Now all that was left to do is stick it in and make sure that it works. Before plugging it in and risking starting a fire, I decided to check the voltages on that kind of janky 6-pin power connector that I soldered on, just to make sure it was going to output the right voltages and that there was no voltage between the two 12-volt lines, and everything checked out, everything looked great, so I decided to hook it up and give it a try. It was a bit of a tight squeeze, so I had to end up switching some of the ports. I had to switch the parallel port with the joystick ports. Oh yeah, I stuck a parallel port in this too. And yeah, I was very relieved when I finally powered it on, and it actually turned on. Finally, I got a GPU that worked in here. My only big concern was that I was using an HP OEM 180 watt power supply with a video card that had a 110 watt TDP. But it turns out, when you use such a low power CPU with a GPU, it actually throttles it to the point it doesn't use nearly that much power. So I lucked out that way. It's kind of funny how when you flip these HP pre-builts upside down, the layout actually looks more normal because they have the motherboard mounted on the opposite side of the case from what you normally see. There it is, the cute little Pentium J2900. It almost looks like a Socket 7 CPU. It's got its laptop RAM, DDR3, 8GB, and yeah, there's my fake hard drive on the left with those cables that make people wonder what kind of hard drive is that, until you follow the cables and discover they are connected to some Commodore 64 joystick ports and a serial port. And there is the GPU that miraculously works fine in this system without drawing too much power. And the whole reason why I wanted the external power connector is so I wasn't drawing too much power from the PCIe by 1 slot because some of these old Gen 2 slots can only supply up to about 25 watts of power. And this card obviously requires more than that. I was happy that I was finally able to get my PCI 2003 Wireless G card to work. All I needed to do in Linux was change the power level from 2 to 3. Here you can see where I hid my jury-rigged internal powered USB hub that I made out of an old external hub, and all of the USB components on the inside, including the Bluetooth, the joystick adapter, and the guitar link connect into that. You might think I was lying when I said I added a hard drive in one of my shorts. Well, I did add a hard drive, just not where you thought I added it. I added it in the CD drive bay, just using one of those CD drive bay hard drive adapters. I decided to use an old 500GB hard drive that was in a laptop. I replaced this drive because it makes annoying clicky sounds, but since I only use it for running games that I already have backed up, I decided it was fine if it dies, because it's all backed up anywhere. Alright, let's take a look at our beautiful rear I/O. We have this very unassuming OEM HP power supply, 2 original Commodore 64 ports from the 1980s that I special ordered from Hungary, and a very chunky Linksys Wireless G adapter right there from 2003. And we have a parallel port and a serial port that are from the 1990s. And there we have our GTX 610, not 610 anymore, though it looks the same on the outside. We have the GTX 650 Ti, and it's nice because it only takes up that 1 slot. And then we have PS2 ports, like the original computer that I programmed the Dragon Man game on. It was an IBM PS2, where those ports get the name from. And then, of course, we have USB and 1 USB 3.0 that I will be connecting to this USB 3 external SATA hard drive with all my Steam games on for some testing. Instead of dual booting this system, I decided to triple boot it, so I installed the latest Ubuntu release, Windows 10, because Windows 11 sucks, and Batocera. Batocera is a lovely emulation station type operating system that allows you to emulate various consoles from older ones like the original Commodore 64, the original Atari, to newer ones like the Wii. You can even run your own Pygame games on it. Okay, let's get into it and see what this machine can do as far as gaming goes.
That's when I remembered I suck at Super Mario Brothers.
It was super fun being able to play the original Atari Joust with an actual Atari joystick. It's been forever since I've done that. The Metroid series has always been one of my favorites. It's one of the first games that really let you play as a female lead character, and I loved that about it. But in general, it's just super fun. It's fun for people of any gender to play, I think. Street Fighter II Turbo was also a game I enjoyed playing with my older brothers, and the only character I could really beat anyone at with was Chun-Li because she has her super fast lightning kick. As you can see here, I showed Zangief, or Zangief, however you pronounce his name, showed him who's boss. I decided to ease into PC gaming with something that I knew this system could run. So I started off with Portal on reasonably high settings, and it runs at a pretty steady 60 FPS. It has the occasional dip here and there, but overall, Portal runs perfectly on this system. It is a game that predates this CPU though, so if it couldn't run it, that would be very disappointing. Now, let's get into something a little bit more intense than Portal, shall we? Next, I decided to try out the latest release of Minecraft, and it ran pretty well for the most part. If you were entering new areas, sometimes while the CPU is loading and pegged at 100%, it would slow down to the 30s in the FPS, but usually it was pretty close to 60 or even better sometimes. Sometimes it'd even get up to the 100s if I went down underground mining things. This is probably the area where it struggled the most. Then I decided to try out Tomb Raider Underworld, and Tomb Raider Underworld ran perfectly. No issues whatsoever with this game. This can handle it like a champ. Then I decided to try out one of my all-time favorites, LEGO Worlds, and I was actually severely disappointed by the performance in this game. This is at 720p, and we're not even getting 30 FPS. Pretty close to it. It's pretty steadily close to 30 FPS, so I guess it's playable. But yeah, definitely not the performance I expected to get out of a game this old. But it's still fun to play, and I was able to beat a chicken to death, so all in all, it was a success. Next, I decided to give Shadow of Mordor a shot. It's an older game, but it is more graphically intensive than even some modern games. And it was kind of borderline playable. Frame rates were pretty close to 30 most of the time, but we had some bad frame drops. Overall, it was mostly playable. One interesting thing about this is that changing the resolution between 1080p and 720p usually didn't improve performance in any games. In fact, some games ran better at 1080p with this combination. Skyrim, for example, all these will be running at 1080p from here on out. Skyrim ran pretty well. In areas where it was snowing like this, we saw the worst FPS, but they're still pretty close to 30, usually above 30. We did have some frame drops here and there as new areas were loading in, and that's really the weakness of this CPU, since it's only using like 1 to 3 watts this entire time. Up next, I figured I'd give Fallout 4 a shot, but Fallout 4 ran worse than anything I tried on this, if you can even call it running. So I'm using GeForce Experience to record this. That did slow it down a bit, but the performance was terrible. So I decided to try out Borderlands 2, and for the most part Borderlands 2 was playable. I got frame rates between 25 and 45 FPS depending on the areas I was in, but in areas where there was a lot of action, sometimes it dropped down into the 15s. 15 FPS. It wasn't the best experience, but it was for the most part playable. Then I tried out Valley. It's one of my all-time favorite games. It's a combination of parkour and playing Jesus, getting to resurrect things from the dead. It's a very strange game, but super fun. I would recommend you play it for a quick short playthrough. As far as performance in this game on this system, I would definitely not recommend this hardware for playing this game. This game is very fast-paced, and though the frame rate's centered around 30 FPS, it's just too jarring, and you need to react way more quickly when you're jumping around and running as fast as you can run in this game. So I would definitely not recommend this hardware for this game. I was pleasantly surprised to see how well it ran Tomb Raider from 2013 at high settings 1080p. It ran pretty well. It's very playable and stayed above 30 FPS the entire time. And averaged more into like 48 FPS, so I would say this is a playable experience. Rise of the Tomb Raider, on the other hand, was not so great. This is on much lower settings, so on the lowest settings here we're only getting between 15 and 35 FPS, yet it is running like it is even slower than that. For some reason the FPS counter and the actual frames you're seeing don't match up. That might be because I'm using GeForce Now to record, and with the limited processor bandwidth, that can cause some issues. I was very pleasantly surprised to see that Rise of the Tomb Raider performed worse than Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So here we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, 75% resolution, and it is running better than Rise of the Tomb Raider was. So it's a bit better optimized, I think, but we still had some pretty low frame drops, but overall it looks better. There were some areas like this where the results looked almost playable. And I even got frame rates into the 40s here, which is surprising. This is a 3-watt CPU running on a 10-year-old GPU that is running at half its power rating. In fact, less than half its power rating. The entire system uses between 30 watts and 90 watts, depending on how we're taxing it. Usually, playing this game, it just took about 60 watts total for the entire system. But there were some areas that inexplicably would have frame drops down to 5 FPS. I'm just sitting in a puddle here doing nothing, getting 5 FPS. Why? I don't know. Because for some reason, the CPU just can't handle this game. I mean, maybe because it's an old CPU that wasn't made to handle a game this graphically intensive. I decided to laugh a little and run the benchmark on this, and the results were quite comical. Better than expected in some areas, but much worse than expected in others, and there we can see a lovely average of 9 FPS. Definitely not the recommended hardware for this system, but a miracle that I got it running. Then I decided to try out The Witcher 3. And while I was recording it, the frame rates were not nearly as good as when I wasn't recording it, so the actual experience that I got was pretty cinematic, I guess, between 24 frames per second and 32-ish, and this is on low settings, 1080p, but it was surprisingly more playable than I thought it would be, and more playable than what you can see while I'm recording it here. But what really interested me about this game was this is the only game I tried out where both the GPU and CPU were constantly pegged at 100%. And this is the one game where the whole computer drew like 90 watts of power. That's the most power I've ever seen it draw. Normally while gaming, it would draw between 65 and 75 watts, or less. But this one somehow utilized this system's entire potential. It was a beautiful sight. Then I decided to push it to the limit and see if this would run Bright Memory Infinite. I had to set the settings down to the very lowest. I think this is at like 50% resolution scaling at 1080p, because for some reason they actually run better at 1080p with this arrangement. Switching it down to 720 only helped out in LEGO Worlds of all games, but in other games it actually runs worse, or the same. And this was quite the slideshow in some areas, but in other areas I would get playable frame rates. It was strange. It would be like 30 FPS pretty consistently until I moved, and I guess the areas with more water in were the ones where the frame rates were slower. One of the ways I got this to run every single game that I own on such old hardware is by using the latest drivers. Now if you go to the NVIDIA website and search for the recommended drivers for your card, it almost always recommends older drivers. So you have to really search around to figure out what the most up-to-date drivers are that will run on your card. So I recommend doing that. After running all these tests in these different games, I realized I forgot the most important factor. I forgot to turn on my RGB. How am I supposed to get maximum FPS if I forget to turn on my RGB? Every gamer knows RGB is the most important factor in boosting FPS. So I did. I switched on my RGB and I decided to do all the testing all over again to make sure I get the maximum performance out of this Pentium J2900. I was kicking myself so hard. How could I have forgotten my RGB? I spent so much time installing it and figuring out how to get it in this old system to boost performance, and I just went ahead and forgot I even had it. Well, here we have it on, installed underneath the front bezel very stealthily, and now we're going to play Shadow of the Tomb Raider again. Alright, now that we have our RGB enabled, we can crank the settings up to high and really push this Pentium J to its limits and see what the GTX 650 Ti is capable of. And would you look at that, we are getting frame rates at above 60 FPS. That's incredible. I'm just kidding. This was recorded on my other gaming computer with a 1060, not a 650. While RGB really does not boost FPS, it was a lot of fun just to add some hidden RGB under the front bezel here. I just used a cheap strip of those LEDs that you can stick around your TV. I don't know why anyone would do that, but that's what they market it for. And it plugs into my internal USB hub, and there you can see the USB Bluetooth adapter that I hid under the front bezel as well. So it gives it a little bit of extra flair to make this system a bit more fun and entertaining, I think. To test the power consumption while doing various tasks, I decided to use one of those simple plug-in power meters you can see on the lower right there. And at idle, the system got power ratings at about 30 watts, so it consumed about 30 to 35 watts at idle, or just doing, regular tasks like web browsing, watching YouTube. It really didn't use very much power for non-GPU intensive things. While playing games, you can see that it's using a bit more power, but it's still a fairly low power system. It uses less power than my laptops do. I mean, it uses like half the power of my gaming laptop, and less power than my old Lenovo. So overall, we get pretty decent power ratings for the performance that we're getting out of a desktop. I mean, these are like laptop level power ratings we're getting here. Here we are playing Tomb Raider, and you can see it's going a little higher. So the more graphically intensive the game is, the more we're utilizing the CPU and the GPU at the same time, the higher that goes. But the absolute max that I saw was about 90 watts. I never saw it go higher than that, and it rarely even got that much. And you can undervolt the GPU to keep things around 60 watts if you'd like, and the performance difference isn't really that different. One thing I absolutely love about this build is I can use it as a guitar amp. I don't need a bunch of separate devices. And not just any guitar amp, I can write my own programs or use various different kinds of programs. There's several that come with Ubuntu, there's several that come with Windows. And I can use these programs to create all sorts of different effects that I would need so many effects pedals and other devices to make happen with a standard guitar amp. And it's using less power than a lot of guitar amps use. Now, is the sound quality as good? No, not really if I'm honest, but overall, it sounds pretty great for something that was fairly inexpensive and that uses so little power and that is using recycled parts. And it's perfectly functional for a basic practice amp, which is all I really needed. I have built so many computers in my life, having worked in IT since I was a child, really. And I have to say I had the most fun building this computer because I used parts that span my entire life, all the way back from the 80s. I mean, if we include the guitar jacks, the guitar jack was invented in the 19th century. It's a pretty old thing. They didn't originally use it for guitar jacks, they used it for telephone switchboards, but it's the same jack. So we have technology that spans over 100 years. I mean, that's pretty impressive, I think. I think that too often in today's world we get caught up in this desire to have the latest and greatest, and there seems to be a lot of shaming of people that don't have the latest and greatest. Oh, my PC's better because of this and that, or I could do better because of this and that. But really, the important thing isn't that we have the latest and greatest. The important thing is that we have fun doing what we do. And I think I demonstrated in this build that we can have fun with some very old hardware. We can have fun with hardware that is practically garbage to most people. And we can take that hardware and with some work turn it into something special that we can do a lot of things on that other people's fancy PCs can't do. And that's really the message I want to send on my channel, is that we can recycle old things into amazing new things. So if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I appreciate all the support, and I hope to make more videos like this in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a very lovely day. Take care.